Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Reporting from Russia has never been easy, and now, when there is little agreement or collaboration on any issue between Russia and the West, that task has become near impossible. But so much of the West's understanding of Russia comes from the work of foreign correspondents, and I'm hoping that my guest today can help put the current events into a broader historical context. James Rodgers is an associate professor in international journalism and assistant vice president of global engagement at City University of London. He is an academic, veteran journalist, and author of the fascinating book Assignment Moscow, Reporting on Russia from Lenin to Putin. He has also written incisively about reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and is an expert on the reporting of armed conflict and journalism in history. He is also widely published in online and print publications and academic journals, including NBC Think, History Today, The New European, and the British Journalism Review. James, welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast.
It's very good to be here, Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, let's start off with your career, and I believe the start of your career was actually by reporting on Russia. That was a different time and a very different world.
It was. I mean, to be more precise, it was actually reporting on the Soviet Union. I'm just about old enough to have been on assignment there. It was my first international assignment, in fact, in the summer of 1991, the last summer of the Soviet Union. And to be honest, I've often compared myself to Orson Welles, who had his greatest success with Citizen Kane at the age of 25. I'm not claiming that my reporting fell into that category, but just that for somebody starting out on their career, it was really a remarkable moment to see the world that I had known as I was growing up, obviously, as a teenager in the 1980s, a time of rearmament, a time of greater confrontation between East and West, and what turned out actually to be the last decade of the Cold War, but it certainly didn't feel like that earlier in the decade. So I think it was really a remarkable experience to be there when this system came down and to feel being part of that generation where we thought we were going to see peace in Europe, if not forever, certainly for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. And I was studying Russian at the time. I think I went to Russia in 1991 for the first time as a student. And it was about the same time where Russian departments around the country were being defunded. And especially money that used to come from the MOD was rapidly being withdrawn.
It was, and I think, if we made a sort of strategic error in education in this country or in priorities of what we should be teaching. I mean, I have to say, Jonathan, I'm a linguist. I like you. I did Russian at university, but I did Russian and French at university. But I've always made it my business as a journalist to try to master even a few words of any place, country, or territory that I worked in. Master a few words of the language there. And I think if we look back now, 30 years on from that, and the lack of expertise and lack of language knowledge, I think, I'm not saying that it would have prevented, this collapse in relations with Russia, but I think it might have better prepared us as policymakers, as experts, as whoever, for seeing it coming and therefore being better prepared to deal with it. And I think, as you'll know, I mean, one of the people I write about in my book is Arthur Ransom, who rather glibly asserts at one point that Russian's a very easy language for people to learn. Mr. Ransom was obviously a better linguist than I, because I mean, I've started 4 or 5 languages, and I certainly wouldn't say that Russian is the easiest of them, certainly not for a non-native speaker. So there is really, really an important role for that expertise in all branches of government, journalism, business, policy making. And I think that the trend which you allude to there, the closure of the Russian schools, or the Russian departments at many universities at what was, then the end of the Cold War, I think was really short-sighted.
Mm. And I mean, coming on to the process of reporting Russia, there's a fascinating book by a Cold War defector called Anatoly Golitsyn called New Lies for Old. Whatever the merits of the book itself, and I think the author was fairly right-wing, but in the history of reporting Russia since 1917, does that book title sort of strike a chord?
Well, it's interesting to see the way in which there's been all sorts of wishful thinking about Russia from the West. And there's been all sorts of suspicions from Russia about the motives of Western correspondents too. And so it's rather bleak now to see the situation in which we find ourselves at the moment. But if you go right back to the Russia's revolutionary year, the two revolutions of 1917, there were very strong and in fact effective attempts to control the way that the message was getting out. When the Tsar first abdicated, the telegraph was cut off. The telegraph links to Europe were cut off by the provisional government, who wants to sort of to establish power before letting the outside world know what was going on. And it's remarkable then to think that something like that could be done so very effectively. And in our own time, though, I think we see the way that journalism is now being controlled in Russia now, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss this in more detail. It's not actually, well, it is impossible to do it in such a complete way, but it's not actually impossible to really restrict the messages getting out. This is something that really has come through, and actually, you know, after the Civil War in the 1920s, when Soviet power was finally consolidated, a lot of the Soviet authorities were understandably dismayed at the fact that, you know, major British and American news organizations had hoped that their regime was going to fall apart and had backed the whites, their opposing side in the Russian Civil War. And one of the consequences was that foreign correspondents were barely allowed into the country legally for a very, very long period afterwards.
I mean, as you say in your book, that there's a really long history of insightful journalism in Russia by foreign correspondents. Obviously very difficult in the early years of the Soviet regime, but there is an equally long list of useful idiots, I think is the phrase you used in your book, since then as well, whom the Kremlin have seen as being assets. Can you explain what you mean by useful idiots? And do they come in different shapes and sizes?
It's an infuriating phrase, actually, because as I'm sure many listeners will know, it's often attributed to Lenin, but I was never in my research able to find a precise citation in which he said that. You know, the idea about a useful idiot is that somebody, a Western opinion former, very often a journalist, came to the Soviet Union or subsequently to Russia, and was able to gather a favorable impression of what was going on there, and basically to help to spread, in Lenin's case, the message that the early Soviet authorities wanted to spread to the world. And so it's attributed to Lenin because he found people like this useful to win the propaganda battle. Lenin, like any leader in the 20th century and beyond, understood very well the value of getting your message out there in the way that you wanted it to be. And to think of sort of clear examples, I mean, I think one of the, some might even put Arthur Ransom into that category, I suppose. For, you know, you can read, when you read his memoirs and you read his accounts of interviewing Lenin, and Ransom actually had excellent access because his second wife, whom he married when he was on assignment in Russia during the revolutionary period, was Trotsky's secretary. So he really was in the inner circle to that sense, in that sense. It's difficult to know, though, to what extent the Soviets really took people like that into their confidence. And I think they really saw it as a one-way street. Yes, they knew if they were going to get recognition, if they were going to win the international propaganda battle, they absolutely needed to get correspondents like that on side. But whether they actually, you know, shared with them their full confidence is a completely different matter. A.J.P. Taylor, writing of John Reed, for example, with his celebrated account of the October Revolution, 10 days that shook the world, you know, notes, and this was quite a historical controversy in itself, because until the copyright on that manuscript expired, the copyright was held by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And when he wrote, when A.J.P. Taylor, the 20th century historian, wrote an introduction questioning, you know, the veracity or validity of some of the accounts, they refused to attach it to, they refused to have it as a foreword for the edition. So he wasn't able to publish that till the copyright had expired. But he points out, you know, he uses this rather cutting phrase, you know, Reed did not in fact know. Now, John Reed was going around revolutionary Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was then called, observing the revolution unfolding. But the extent to which he actually, you know, in the inner circle of revolutionaries actually shared their secrets with him is really open to question. And so I think, you know, in that sense, you know, the early Soviet authorities needed international journalists to help spread their message around the world. But it seems, you know, if that phrase "useful idiots" really is correctly attributed to Lenin, it shows what they probably thought of him in private.
Yeah, and I guess you don't have to collaborate in any sense in order for you to be useful to the regime. So people as diverse as Tucker Carlson and Mearsheimer may have no links, potentially, one would hope not, to the regime itself, but it doesn't stop what they say being used for propaganda purposes.
No, that's absolutely right. And that's why, particularly at the moment, if we think of the dire situation in which we find ourselves now in the state of relations between the West and Russia, the Russians will gleefully seize upon any perceived difference of opinion in the West, anything that can be interpreted as supporting their cause. But I think that's probably just something that goes with any kind of armed conflict, and I don't think that in itself should be allowed to stifle debate. If people wish to express the view that that the NATO enlargement is a contributory factor to the situation in which we find ourselves, I think that's a useful part of Western debate, even if it's not a view to which, of course, any Western governments currently subscribe. But I think it is important. It's one of the strengths of our system. And of course, I'm not for a moment pretending that Western democracy hasn't got its problems at the moment, because obviously it has. But it is one of the strengths of the system that these discussions can go on. And one, sadly, which has become entirely absent in Russia now, successively so over the last 10 years.
On a more positive note, though, who have been the outstanding foreign correspondents since 1917, and has any particular era of the development of Russia produced, more of these kind of characters than another?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think one whom I probably admire most, and he possibly fell into the useful idiot category for some people towards the end, is Morgan Phillips Price, who was correspondent for the Manchester Guardian at the time of the revolutions. I mean, he was actually in Georgia at the time in 1917 and had difficulty getting back. And the reason why I mentioned that he fell into the propagandist track later was that a pamphlet that he wrote was published in large quantities by the Bolsheviks and distributed by propaganda leaflets to the opposing side in the war to British soldiers who'd come to intervene on the side of the whites in the Russian Civil War after the revolution and after the First World War. This basically cost him his career. But I mean, to put his work into fuller context, his analysis of why the provisional government failed in 1917, his understanding of why the Bolsheviks were able to seize power and to enjoy a degree of popularity was absolutely without parallel. And this was at a time, the Manchester Guardian, which of course became the Guardian, was then as now left liberal leaning. But if you look at the newspapers that were owned by Lord Northcliffe, who founded the Daily Mail, and at the time of the First World War also owned the Times, and the Daily Telegraph too, then as now a conservative-leaning newspaper. There's a colossal amount of wishful thinking. There's this idea that after the revolution of 1917, if you look at the articles that were published in the fall of that year, you will find very frequently these suggestions that the Bolsheviks have only got a few weeks to go and that their administration is going to collapse. It probably didn't last as long as they thought, but it did last for 74 years after all, in one form or another. But there's an awful lot of wishful thinking. I really think in that particular period, Phillips Price reporting really cut through a lot of this. And he writing his memoirs, and he lived until the late 1960s, and his later memoirs, he didn't express any regret for what he'd done. He still felt that the revolution was justified against Tsarist autocracy. But the clarity with which he writes and the explanations with which he writes was really, really valuable for understanding at the time, and not one which was taken on board by media owners or policymakers, to the extent, we have Bruce Lockhart, the diplomat and spy, admitting in a memoir in the 1930s, that we didn't take this seriously enough, we didn't understand it enough, with the consequent implications for policy. Because you will find right throughout the 20th century, and even into this one, this expression from members of the Soviet political elite, and not necessarily ones that were vehemently opposed to cooperating with the West. I'm talking about Khrushchev and Gorbachev in particular. This expression, this regret that the Western armies and the Western governments tried to, in effect, to strangle the Soviet state at birth. And this really rankles, and it goes right throughout. And this is part of Russia's sort of suspicion of the West, if you like. And so in this policy, which didn't even succeed after all, is one of those. I think another correspondent I would pick out, I think perhaps because he's more of an interesting character, because he was a great correspondent. One of the things I researched in the book was to go through the BBC's written archives, where you can read the memoirs, the editors, the memos, as they were, memoranda that editors wrote about correspondence. And one rather unkindly said about Worth, he is not, as you probably know, a great broadcaster. This was written in pencil on top of a memo, but I think he was at Stalingrad when the Nazi armies were defeated there. And his description, it must have been an amazing moment in history. As you probably know, Jonathan, this was a great military disaster for the Germans. More than 20 generals were captured, which is not, the kind of thing that any army wants to see happen. And he describes these generals under lock and key, and radiating venom is the phrase that he uses. And it's just a remarkable moment in history to be able to have been present at that. And his own background was very, very interesting. He had been born into a liberal family in pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg, and had lived in the West, and then returned in the 1940s as a correspondent. So I think his own personal story and the stories that he tells of people in Moscow, because of course he was a native Russian speaker, so he could go around and chat to people in shops and report these afterwards. They really make fascinating reading now as a kind of social history to go alongside the military and political history of that period.
Oh, I definitely want to follow up on that. That sounds absolutely fascinating.
And I should also mention, if I may, Shelley Roeder, who was one of the first women to go to report there, went there in the 1950s and seems to have sort of, charmed her way into diplomatic cocktail parties, and came back with some really, really interesting stories from there too. And so I think, there's a lot of interesting characters. Russia is perhaps not for the faint-hearted or for the unenterprising in that sense, I think.
Well, I've got a question actually that is exactly about that in a second, and my own introduction to learning Russian. But continuing on the topic of foreign correspondence, bringing this up to date, some correspondents have been seen as more extreme than others, and the Russian government has even slapped many of them with labels like Russophobic. And I think one great example of that is Luke Harding, the first Western correspondent since the end of the Cold War to be deported from the country and barred from entering Russia. And for a long time, I think he was seen as extreme amongst foreign correspondents for his unflinchingly negative view of the Putin regime. But since then, many more journalists have followed up by being barred from the country, and many native Russian journalists, of course, have had to flee in fear of their lives. So I'd be interested to hear your views on not necessarily, individuals, but on that tendency for journalists to have to be sort of pro or anti or given these labels.
Yeah, it's certainly a country that, particularly at times of major crisis, elicits strong emotions. We definitely saw that right back to 1917 when, Morgan Phillips Price, whom I mentioned earlier, had a sort of spat in print, and nowadays it would have been conducted on Twitter, one imagines, with Robert Wilton, his opposite number from the Times. It's very interesting when they wrote their memoirs, and a lot of these memoirs, because of the censorship problems and because of the technical problems of getting material out, a lot of these correspondents actually had to publish their dispatches in very hastily published memoirs. Because, while they still remain sort of vaguely newsworthy. Interesting contrast between Morgan Phillips Price and Robert Wilton is that Price dedicates his memoir to the revolution, and Robert Wilton dedicates his to the Cossacks, whom he expresses the firm hope will overturn the revolution and restore the previous regime. So two really, really sharply contrasting views. During Perestroika, during the reforms, the late Soviet period, you get more sort of unanimity on Western views on that. It was a time of far greater optimism, of course. But coming up to the present time, yes, you're right. There's a couple of ways of looking at it. There's no question that post-Soviet Russia has had its problems all the way through. And now, of course, with the not exactly this expulsion of large numbers of journalists, but you probably saw the list that was published recently of those people who were subject to sanctions, in the words of the Russian foreign minister, and therefore clearly can't enter the country. And so I think that this is more the phenomenon in a way is perhaps not, and if more people are coming around to have a more negative view of Russia, I think that's because a more negative view of Russia is clearly merited now than it has been at any other time in the post-Soviet period. I think, the decades when I spent long times there, being the 1990s and the first decade of this century, the society was still in transition, it was still emerging, and sadly, I think we can pretty much see, in the last 5 years, Russia has settled upon the direction it's going to take. And while most of us, who've watched Russia for a long time, didn't expect an invasion of Ukraine of the nature and scale that has unfolded, it was pretty clear the direction in which the administration under President Putin was going. So yes, I think there's a lot of people. Societies do change, and Russia in the 2000s was a much more liberal and open society than it is now 15 years later. It was a very different society, and now I think we talked earlier about the expertise that's going to that disappeared arguably with the fewer numbers of people studying Russian in this country and in the West in general. What concerns me now is that it is going to become all but impossible for journalists to work normally in Russia, for academic researchers to visit there. So I think there's going to be a real sort of dearth of current topical expertise coming out there and observation. I think that is a concern. But yes, I mean, to answer your original point, I think, the reason why views of Russia have become more negative in the last few years is because what is happening there has been of greater and greater concern. Now I think, with hindsight, it's pretty easy to see that the systematic suppression of any kind of form of political dissent was quite possibly in preparation for this. The last time I was in Russia was in 2019. I was supposed to go in 2020, but the pandemic had just started. And I remember I hadn't been in Moscow for many years. And that day there was a protest about new restrictions that the government was proposing to place on use of the internet. Now, if I'd been there in the 1990s or even in the 2000s, early 2000s, I thought I'll go along and have a look and see what's going on. It seemed to me, and I was there on an academic visa that time because I was conducting academic research and I was visiting colleagues at Russian universities. But it seemed to me very unwise to go, just in case, I was taken as some way of having joined the demonstration. So I stayed away and I did something else instead. But it was just, already then I thought this is going to, I could be picked up by the police. This is what happens at Russian demonstrations now. I would just be interested to go and see the size and the number of people who are there. Quite normal journalistic academic curiosity, but it didn't feel safe to do that. It felt like a risk, that I might have ended up getting deported myself or, be accused of not using my visa for proper purposes or whatever. And that's 3 years ago now. And I think those things have only just continued. And I think the expulsion of correspondents, well, I think it says two things. I think it shows the fact that Russia is really the present presidential regime, and I do make the distinction between that and the country Russia itself, is not willing to brook any sort of criticism of its conduct. But the second thing, in a way, I think this is a more positive thing, is that they still set great store by what is written about them in the international mainstream media, as we might say these days. And I think that shows that even in a time of declining budgets and declining audiences, these international correspondents still have a huge influence.
Absolutely. And I think that must be mirrored in some ways in the vast amounts of money that Russia spends on external propaganda, whether it's, the RT network or whether it's the more, stuff I've been exploring with some of the people I'm talking to, which is the huge investment in troll factories and in trying to influence debate on digital media, whether that be to poison the debate or to swing it with some kind of favorable coverage. They clearly care a lot about what the world thinks, even if they don't do an awful lot to create positive PR, certainly at the moment. But I think you've highlighted there something which is a much broader and much sort of deeper issue about reporting complex countries like Russia. And much of the coverage we see in the media is, by its nature, based on events, where a particular event or demonstration or crisis punctuates the news. But this crisis-focused or events-based requirement, doesn't that tend to really miss the big picture? and create narratives about a country that are too simplistic. So, for instance, talking about the demonstrations, it's been clear that institutions and the rule of law have been systematically degraded since 2012. I mean, they never really established themselves, but they've been really sort of going downhill for more than 10 years. But based on the way the news is reported, you tend to only hear about it when a crisis comes to a head.
Yeah, I mean, that's an eternal challenge for foreign correspondents, and Russia is really one exception of that. A very good example of that, in the sense that it is during times of crisis that it attracts the most attention. And one phrase that international correspondents will often use about their postings is it's either feast or famine. In other words, you're getting in the paper every day, or you're getting 2 articles in the paper every day. You're on every single bulletin, or there's nothing going on that really interests audiences. And I think one way to address that is to try to tell those trends, because the trends are the important thing, but trends are really more or less, they're the subject of of academic research, in the way that events are the subject of journalism. But of course, journalism can't tell the full story without trying to capture some of those trends somehow. I think actually one of the pieces of journalism that I'm most proud of in all the many years I worked there was a long report that I produced for the BBC's Newsnight programme in 1998, working with correspondent Alan Little and cameraman Andrew Kilrain. And our brief was just to explain the Russian economy, which is pretty hard to do in TV terms, because it's something that might lend itself to an article for a think tank, or something more thoughtful in the pages of the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or something like that. But our brief was to try to do this for a sort of an interested TV audience, let me put it that way. So what we did was we went to a southern city, and we found things that illustrated the economic hardships that people were going through then. Now, this was just before in the late summer of 1998, Russia defaulted on its domestic debt, precipitating the second serious crisis in that decade. Because don't forget, Jonathan, a lot of people in effect lost their savings with the freeing of prices after the end of the Soviet period. And the same thing happened again in 1998 when the ruble plummeted in value. So what we did was we went to this factory, which was working at a fraction of its capacity, and where people were actually being paid in gherkins, because it was a barter economy. It was making agricultural machinery, combine harvesters and things like that. And they'd sold some to Bulgaria. But the Bulgarian, another post-socialist economy, was also very strapped for cash. So they'd actually supplied, at least paid part of the bill in canned and tinned and conserved vegetables. And this was remarkable. This was southern Russia. This is rich agricultural land. There's plenty of gherkins in southern Russia, even if there wasn't much else. And this just seemed, particularly tough. People were living in a cashless economy at that time. People would barter what they had. People were using their small allotments on their dachas outside town to get fresh fruit and vegetables. The person to whom we spoke, one of the workers from the factory whom we featured in our report, the only cash that his family had coming in was his mother-in-law's pension. That was the only cash that they had coming in, because his wages hadn't been paid for months, and when they were given, in goods rather than in cash. And this, I think, really helped us sort of tell the story, because I think I felt afterwards, and Alan put this question, what are the consequences? What are the political consequences of anger like that? He said after an outburst from one of the workers on the factory floor about the frustrations he felt. And I don't think we were able to answer that question for a couple of years afterwards, but the answer to that question was a leader like Vladimir Putin. So in that case, I think we did capture a trend. But yes, it's a bit of a tough sell to an editor. But if you get those sort of striking human stories, like the man whose only cash income is his mother-in-law's pension, like this cavernous, huge Soviet-era factory working to a fraction of its capacity, then I think you can begin to tell that story. And I'm very proud of that as a piece of journalism, because I think it did manage to illustrate a trend in ways that, and actually, both Alan and Andrew, when on flights out of Moscow, when there was a much bigger expatriate community there, people sort of said, oh, did you work on that story? Because it really resonated and really helped to tell, the longer term trends of the situation in Russia at that time.
Absolutely. And to an extent, that latent anger is partly what we see coming through now, isn't it? So the generation who are under 40 and primarily get their news from the internet, to some extent, will hear about what you've just said there at secondhand from their own relatives. They didn't experience it directly. Whereas those who are over 40 and primarily get their news from TV, in some ways, TV propaganda is amplifying and reviving that resentment that comes from those years.
Yes, I think it is. And it is going to be very interesting. Then we can see a few examples in the last few years where the Kremlin, which I'll use as shorthand for President Putin's administration, have been very adept at keeping a lid on state TV. Now, for a number of reasons, not least geographical, TV has long been the dominant medium in Russia. It wasn't really practical to have national newspapers in the same way that you do in some other countries across all those time zones. And yes, you're absolutely right. With certain demographics, with certain age groups, that has endured, and people do, to a large extent, as far as one can tell, believe what they see there. But one of the skills of younger protesters, and I'm thinking here particularly of Alexei Navalny and his followers, has been to use digital media, to use, particularly in Navalny's case, YouTube, very, very effectively, in a way that has, I think, to an extent, caught President Putin and his advisors rather flat-footed. And they haven't, it's a difficult balancing act here, because, you'll have seen those reports in recent years where Russia has been experimenting with cutting off the internet and having an internet that just works in Russia. And it's been presented in terms of, if we were ever subject to a cyber attack from a hostile power. But obviously people were thinking, well, actually, this is about preventing flows of information. But Russia's always been quite reluctant to do about that. I mean, I think in the 2000s and up until, even up until very recently, there was a reluctance for Russia, the Russian political elite, to go the way of, say, China and just say, okay, we're just going to ban these sites. Now, of course, we're here. We've reached that situation, either because things have been banned from within or because some social media sites no longer wish to function there. But in effect, Russia is, well, to an extent at least, cut off. It'd be interesting to see. And I was discussing this with somebody the other day, how many people have downloaded VPNs to try to circumvent this. Not one suspects, at least at this stage, enough to try to shift public opinion. But there's a real generational thing there. And so I think whoever comes after President Putin, and of course, Mr. Putin is approaching his 70th birthday. There's no signs of his going anywhere, but he can't go on forever. But whoever comes after him will probably need to be a bit more, and whatever of shade, political shade, that administration is going to be, they will need to be able to become more savvy with this, because Russians, I mean, I think it's quite a long time ago that mobile phone ownership in Russia went over 100%. Obviously, suggesting therefore that while there's some people don't have any devices, there's enough people who've got 2 or possibly even 3. And I suppose, slightly provocatively, if one looks at the fact that Russians are noted as the most effective hackers in the world, or many of, if there were a world hacking competition, Russia would probably do quite well in it. Now, whatever one thinks of hacking per se, that does show a certain ability with information technology. So I think all these things mean that absolutely it's right to highlight that generational shift. But at the moment, I fear, those reports about people downloading VPNs notwithstanding, what the current administration has succeeded in doing is placing 20th century controls on 21st century media. And I think there's a reason here for us to reflect on this idea that now we've got social media, nobody can lie to us. I mean, I don't think anyone really thinks that now, but as with so many new media that come along, people say, okay, now it's going to be impossible for tyrants to lie to us. But I think, Russia seems very successful to have controlled that now. And I think there are big implications for future understanding, because one day, I live in hope that I will live to see Russia and the West getting on far better than they do now. And part of that is going to be understanding, different perspectives, of which sadly, all sides in this conflict are increasingly starved.
Unfortunately, I think you're the 8th person I've interviewed. Most of the others are authors and academics, and you've probably expressed the most optimistic point of view there, and none of the others have a particularly optimistic point of view. I think including many of the Russians who I speak to and see, believe that probably the next person who comes into the Kremlin might be even more extreme than Putin, but they believe may, create the groundwork for better relations, ironically. But again, I think no one quite knows what's gonna happen.
No, I mean, I would agree with that note of caution. I mean, it's if we think of some other cases of, countless examples, not just from that particular part of the world, but from around, you often see that when a country is in a crisis, then there is an opposition waiting to take power. There's nothing of the sort in Russia at all. I mean, whatever one thinks of Alexei Navalny, there was no, and however one might admire his personal courage in returning to Russia to, face certain imprisonment, there's no suggestion, I don't think, that he was at the head of a mass movement that was ready to take power. And I think, there's every expectation, every reason to think that the next president of Russia will be somebody from a similar political persuasion and from a similar part of, a similar part of Russian society. So, no, very, very difficult. I think, unfortunately, to be optimistic, which is why, I talk in terms of living to see this. It's more than 30 years since I first went to Russia, and I have no idea when I will get the chance to go there again now.
And at this point, I guess all we can hope for is that someone who comes in, even if they're extremely nationalist right-wing, has a pragmatic turn of mind and a far less conspiratorial turn of mind. I think that's a good point to sort of turn it towards the difficulties of reporting in Russia. As we know, in the Soviet Union, many individuals, and I'm guessing many correspondents as well, got their news from anecdotes, rumors, rather than traditional news sources that you'd get in the West. And it's been claimed that especially the Kremlin has returned to an extremely toxic mode of conspiratorial thinking, post-truth, as it were. How difficult does that make the job of the foreign correspondent?
I think it makes it extremely difficult. And if we look at, this infamous legislation that's been introduced as well, suggesting that, in effect, for calling a war, you could get 15 years in jail. So I think it is very, very difficult. It seems to me, as an outsider, that it is the practice of independent journalism, as we understand it in the West, has become all but impossible in Russia. And so that, that really is a huge challenge. And I think that's going to have consequences for everyone. It's, it's our for our understanding of what's going on. I mean, I might mention here, Jonathan, that I think, you referred earlier briefly to the Kremlin's propaganda outlets. I think that banning them in the West was pretty short-sighted and indeed counterproductive. I understand the political motivation behind it, but I think banning outlets like RT and Sputnik, and because obviously I used to follow them just to see what they were saying. Every time I go on Twitter now, you get this notice saying this has been banned in all the following territories. It lists all the EU countries and the UK and everything else. But I think, that's had a number of disadvantages. I think it's allowed them to sort of hilariously, absurdly, to play martyrs for free speech. And it is also, it's also overstating their influence, which I don't think was that great to begin with. But the other thing is, it's depriving us of the narratives of getting a sense of what is being fed to the Russian population. We get a sense of this. We see President Putin's speeches and so on. But it is interesting for those of us, who want to watch what's going on, to see what's being discussed. Because if this is part of understanding, and I'm not optimistic that the war in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon. I fear this is going to last years, in fact. And it seems, from looking at recent media reports over the weekend, that Western policymakers are increasingly of that view too. But I think it is important, while it's difficult for us, for Western correspondents, to practice sort of independent journalism, you might have seen that, a number of correspondents have as you mentioned, left the country. A number of them are in Riga, which is, a curious historical parallel with the situation almost exactly 100 years ago after the Civil War, as I was describing earlier. But I think it has become very difficult for people to work there. And it's not just the fact that, even if you can go around and talk to people privately, do you dare to publish what you've got while you're still in the country? Or will it be that people will go on occasional assignments, will publish what they've got once they've left, and thereby, risk incurring the wrath of the authorities there and be put on a list similar to that one that we saw published a few days ago.
And to an extent, the Russian government has been a little helpful in that, haven't they? They've created a list of so-called foreign agents. So if as a blogger or journalist, you find yourself on that list, it's usually as a precursor to some kind of criminal process. And they've used this mechanism to encourage, let's say, people to leave the country, and most have complied with that, not wanting to end up in prison. There are a few notable exceptions, like Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Karamurza, two extremely brave individuals. I'm guessing both of those thought they could have more of an impact by facing the regime head on, whereas most people come to the decision that carrying on writing, commentating, critiquing from abroad is a more useful role to play. It's almost a badge of honor amongst some as well. And those correspondents who haven't ended up on the foreign agents list are probably asking themselves, whether they haven't been harsh enough.
Quite possibly. I mean, I think it is a very, very difficult situation to be in. I don't think that one can underestimate. When I spoke to one Russian journalist whom I didn't previously know about a month after the war ended, a mutual friend had put me in touch with them. And, I think it's, while many of us would not want to, many of us have enjoyed the freedoms of growing up in Western Europe and other freer societies than Russia would not, we don't really have much idea what that's like, but it's still, to leave one's home is not something that anybody takes lightly, particularly, as in many cases, people had to decide to do that very, very quickly. The opposite. As I'm sure you know, Jonathan, there are very, very few flights to Moscow now. I was speaking to somebody just last week who'd left a few weeks ago, and they really, had a terrible time right up to the last minute, like a sort of, a tense scene in a film. You're very, very worried about whether you're actually going to get out or whether you're going to be detained or whatever. But I think for a lot of those Russians who are working in journalism, particularly for Western organizations who did decide to leave, it was a very, very big decision they had to take very, very quickly. Because if you go because you feel that you're in danger, it doesn't mean to say that you can take your entire family with you. And who says just because you don't like your country's government, it doesn't mean to say you don't like your country and particularly want to leave it. I mean, which of us in a democracy hasn't thought, oh my goodness, I'm sick of this or that government? But I think I think we really need to try. It's very hard for us to try to put ourselves in that place, for the sacrifices involved to try to continue, working to tell stories, deprived not only of your sources that you might, chat to regularly, but also, cut off from friends and family. It's extremely difficult.
It is tough, isn't it? And picking up on that word sources, what I'm absolutely fascinated with is both historically, where would foreign correspondents get their information from? And of course, now we're in the world of Twitter and Telegram. Has sourcing intelligence, sourcing insights changed, and how is it going to change further?
That's a really good question, actually. I mean, I think in the early days of, for most of the last century, there was a lot of information that was just given out by official sources. And, during the Second World War, for example, we saw this huge change in the media landscape, rather, I suppose, similar to the advent of digital media, in the sense that, the arrival of radio, as a mass medium in the 1920s and 1930s, really, really changed the way that propaganda worked during the Second World War in a way that it otherwise wouldn't have done. You would see, and this to an extent, going back is where the BBC enjoyed its international reputation from, because, they were considered to have done a good job in broadcasting during the Second World War. Accounts of correspondents, those who were allowed into Moscow during the Second World War, talk absolutely about radio being the medium for news and propaganda, as they put it, while they, of course, are still, often working in print. So, and one thing that they did, which frustrated the correspondents, one thing the Soviet authorities did, was they would not allow any stories during the war to be filed, to be written about, published in the West until Radio Moscow had reported it, which was deeply frustrating, because, especially because of time differences, if Radio Moscow put this story out, editors in London and New York had heard it, And correspondents had already, in effect, been scooped by Radio Moscow, and they might have known about the story, but they couldn't say it. And the censorship was very, very serious. You know, if you broke the censorship rules, you'd probably be thrown out. So there was a combination then of getting it from official sources, from the official bulletins, from the Soviet media, and from what conversations one could have. But, you know, particularly during the Stalinist era, people were very, very, very circumspect about what they would say to any foreigner. Because to be seen to be collaborating or assisting, you know, a foreign perspective, collaborating with foreign intelligence could lead to a long term of imprisonment or worse. And I think I'm not a great believer in golden ages, but I think in the case of you know, the greatest opportunities to tell a story of Russia certainly came in the last decade of the Soviet period, with the reforms known as Glasnost and Perestroika, and under the last Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And then people, you know, not only were ordinary Russian Soviet citizens, they still were perhaps more willing to talk to outsiders. There was a genuine mutual curiosity, and there was a genuine, you know, understanding that a bit more of what journalism was about. But as I say, not to put that into context, there were still very, very strict travel restrictions. You know, you couldn't go more than 40 kilometers from the center of Moscow without special permission. You had to get permission to fly to any other part of the Soviet Union. So in other words, if there was a breaking story somewhere, as there were sometimes with protests in those late Soviet period, it's pretty easy for the authorities to stop Western correspondents to get into them. Coming forward to now, the kind of sources that people use, well, for the last, you know, in the period that I worked in Russia, broadly speaking, from 1991 to 2009, there's lots of different sources, varying degrees of access, officials, ordinary people, you know, all the media, obviously. But now I think it's become very, very much more difficult. You can still, I'm sure, talk to people on the street, but will they want to be quoted by a Western news organization? What can you actually say and feel that you're safe when you're there? You know, as I'm sure you'll have seen, a number of news organizations have simply decided to relocate. You know, some big news organizations, Financial Times, New York Times, and so on, you know, really major news organizations. Others are sort of managing to sort of continue to function, but clearly with nothing like the same sort of freedoms that they previously enjoyed. So I think it is going to become increasingly difficult, actually, to report on a lot of things that would have just been absolutely straightforward before.
And might that not be actually quite interesting? Because I think there is something called a Moscow-centric bias, isn't there? In that many academics, most reporters would have used Moscow as the base to tell stories not just of Russia, but to tell stories of the former Soviet Empire and countries in the Kremlin's so-called sphere of influence. Didn't that, in hindsight, create a kind of not just a Moscow-centric bias, but it created a subtle narrative that the world was seen from a Russian or Kremlin perspective?
I think it probably did to an extent. I mean, it's difficult to avoid this in a way. I mean, I think, you know, the best correspondents, and also I have to add here the best funded ones as well, which is why I'm going to, you know, mention a number of, you know, major media organizations like the New York Times, like the Financial Times, like the BBC, that have budgets that other news organizations don't necessarily have. They've always made a real effort to go and try to report the country outside. But if we think about the trends in the way that the late 20th and early 21st century are going, I mean, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's only a matter of years, perhaps 10 years or so, that for the first time in human history, I think it was the United Nations Population Organization agency responsible for that estimated that for the first time in human history, more people were living in cities than living on the land. And I think, you know, we see this, the way that Moscow has grown in the post-Soviet era. It was a magnet for attracting population and investment, and so in that, and of course the political power was very much concentrated there. So that, I think, in a sense, is inevitable. But it is very, very important. You know, this country the size of Russia, you know, just every time you look at the map of the world and just see how very far this stretches, you know, from the fringes of Western Europe right to the Pacific coast. And, you know, all very close to the United States, almost in its northern corner, very close to Alaska. So I think that's inevitable, but I don't think you can tell the story of any country without occasionally getting out and about and just seeing, because, you know, you get a sense. You go to, you know, you go to small villages, small towns, particularly in the 1990s, when some were suffering serious economic hardship, and you get a much bigger picture than you do. My last visit to Russia, the one I mentioned in 2019, I went to 3 different places. I went to Moscow, I went to Volgograd, and then I went to St. Petersburg. And all of them, particularly Moscow, was really sort of shiny. And the city authorities, as well as the national authorities, had made this real sort of showpiece capital. But I realized afterwards, Jonathan, if I think about the date of this was March 2019. It was less than 12 months since the World Cup. And of course, the 3 cities I'd been to had all been venues for the World Cup. So had all benefited from, well, to say they all benefited from a lick of paint is a gross understatement, but they had all been very much prepared for big delegations of international visitors. So in that sense, I realized I wasn't getting, the clearest impression that I would have done if I just picked some sort of, medium-sized city at random.
Yeah, absolutely, especially a city away from Moscow, away from some of the more developed economies. Many cities obviously had a lot of Western investment, and it's difficult to compare those to ones that didn't. Again, I haven't traveled there for a very long time, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Now, I've got just a couple of questions left. One of these I think is going to be very, very difficult to answer, and it's quite a loaded question here. But sometimes you can see when you watch coverage, whether it be sort of Sky or CNN or even the BBC to an extent, sometimes, watching these, I get the sense that propaganda narratives can work themselves into reporting coverage, especially where you may have junior reporters under pressure to fill airtime. And sometimes the use of ambiguous language or adopting phraseology that's sort of doing the rounds without question it can help to reinforce the Kremlin's interpretation of events. So to give one example of that, using phrases like the breakaway republics, for instance, can make it sound a bit like there's an organic political process going on, rather than a war that's planned and orchestrated by Moscow in the Donbass since 2014. Can the desire to remain neutral, the desire to present both sides and not to judge, actually lead to strong bias within reporting?
It is a difficult question. I think the answer is one thing that, and as you mentioned in your introduction, my main job now is teaching journalism at City University of London. And one thing I'm always really, really conscious, particularly, I teach a module on the reporting of armed conflict. And one thing I always stress to the students on that module, and indeed all the others, is we as journalists have to be very, very careful about whose language we're using. Because, there's a reason why the governments around the world are spending millions of dollars on communications policies, on PR, because they want to get their version of events into mainstream media discussions. And so I think, you have to have a really, really clear reason when you're quoting somebody. If you make it clear that you're quoting them. One of the, the most, the oldest examples is the word terrorist, for example. I've worked for both the BBC World Service and for the Reuters News Agency. Their editorial guidelines broadly say this word should only be used in direct speech. We're trying to broadcast to a large number of audiences, and you will get government ministers saying terrorists did this or terrorists did that. And it, this and other parts of the audience will see things very, very differently. But yes, of course, it is absolutely a risk. And I think, you're absolutely right to highlight the pressures of live broadcasting as well. It's, I think it's something that I think it was possibly something that's maybe peaked in a way, in the sense that most people probably, to a large extent will go to social media first to get their breaking news now, and will watch news channels, for analysis or something like that. Not to say that news channels don't cover breaking stories, of course they do. But yes, it's a very, very real problem, and it is, but it's something that journalists really need to think through and think about. Well, whose words am I using here? Am I going to put this in the words that that my audiences would expect me to, or am I just going to borrow from the various protagonists in the story that I'm reporting without reflecting that it's their words rather than my news organization's words?
Absolutely. I think my last question really is that I believe when we were setting this interview up, you did mention that you're revising your book, and obviously the world has changed dramatically since February of this year. I'd be really interested to learn what changes you're going to be making to the text of your book in order to bring it up to speed.
Yeah, well, yes, well, thank you for the question, Jonathan. I have to say, I'm still thinking about it. I mean, broadly speaking, you know, this is going to be a fairly quick revision. I'm just waiting to sort of agree the timeline with the publisher. I'm hoping it's going to come out next year, but probably not giving away any major secrets when I'm saying there are, you know, there's two big things that have affected the world since the book was first published, you know, almost 3 years ago. That is, of course, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Well, particularly the latter in this region. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking at. But I think it's interesting, as I say, I do think that you know, there is a positive. If there is any positive about the way that some international media are being treated in Russia, you know, in effect being given little choice but to leave, it does, I think, tend to show that even in these ages when we're supposed to be able to get all our news from social media, there is a great deal of value to be had from the experienced correspondent working for an established news organization. And that is why the Kremlin are so afraid of them.
Fantastic. Well, I'm really, really grateful for you spending the time speaking to me. Thank you for the fascinating dive into the work and value of foreign correspondents working in Russia. And I do strongly advise everyone to seek out James's articles and books, especially the one on reporting in Russia, Assignment Moscow. James, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Jonathan.